huge angry crowds lined up outside the banks. The first customers in line got their money, but too many people wanted their money back at the same time. Soon, the banks ran out of the small amount of cash that they nearly kept on hand, right on hand. Then they had to lock their doors until they could get back some of what they had loaned out. Yeah. Then they had to lock their doors until they could get back some of what they had loaned out. But some banks had let too much of their money be invested in stocks that were no longer worth anything. They couldn't get more cash. They had to stay locked out for good. They had to stay locked for good. They had to stay locked for good. It's not good. It's not good. Rah. So huge waves of bank failures spread all over the country. By 1933, about 11,000 banks had failed. That was almost half the banks in the United States. Anyone who had deposited their savings in a bank that closed lost it all. One of the worst things about the bank failures was the fear that they spread. Even people who hadn't lost money were afraid to use banks anymore. The banks that were still open struggled to survive. They had to demand that loans be repaid. Yeah. If a person couldn't pay, then the bank seized something valuable he owned. Many people lost their houses or farms this way. The U.S. economy fell like a house of cards. Each failure made people poorer and more frightened. This made things worse and led to more failures. Even those with money were afraid to spend anything. Suddenly, no one was buying all those cars and radios and electric gadgets, so the factories that made them went out of business. That's not great, you guys. It's a short chapter, if you ask me. It's a short chapter. It's just a short chapter, you guys. So everyone who worked in them lost their jobs. Unemployment went up. Fewer and fewer people had enough to live on. By 1933, 1 out of 4 Americans looking for a job couldn't find one. Among blacks, more than half were employed, more than half were unemployed. From the United States, the Depression spread to the rest of the world. Chapter 4: Hoovervilles and Hobos. The Depression brought terrible suffering. It was worse for people who had been the poorest to begin with, farmers and factory workers. Many who lost their jobs could find no other work. Some had lost their savings when the banks failed. When they couldn't pay the rent, they were thrown out of their apartments. Those who were able to crowd in with relatives, just like in Wall-E. I love Wall-E. But many soon found themselves out on the streets. Rickety shanty towns sprang up in vacant lots to house the thousands of homeless. Shanties were shacks built out of whatever people could find: tar paper, discarded signs, old tires, and scrap metal, just like made from cars, But none of the shanty towns had electricity or running water. Either. Diseases spread. Most cities considered the shanty towns health hazards and tried to tear them down, but they sprang up again. The homeless had no place else to go. Some of the shanty towns were just a few shacks, but some housed several thousand people. The largest ones grew into little cities, unofficial mayors. They had rules to help keep the place clean and safe and to guard against fire. Some even had streets with house numbers so people could get mail. Most living in shanty towns were single men, although some shacks housed entire families. Why my nose itching? So these settlements were called Hoover Hills. This was not a compliment to President Hoover. He kept telling the nation that the prosperity was just around the corner. People with no homes were angry with him. They called the newspapers people slept under to keep themselves warm. Hoover blankets, Hoover leather, referred to the cardboard used to cover the holes in people's shoes, and a Hoover flag was a pocket turned inside out to show that the owner didn't have a penny. For a while, the streets of New York City were filled with apple sellers. Apple growers who couldn't get a good price for their crop let homeless men buy boxes of fruit very cheaply. Then the men sold pieces of fruit on the street for a nickel each. In New York City alone, almost 6,000 men were selling apples, but very few people could afford to pay even a nickel. And most cities had ways to help those in need, but charity programs couldn't handle the vast number of hungry people. Desperate men and women did whatever they could to find food. Some Hoover Hills had small vegetable patches. People hunted rabbits, which were known as Hoover hogs. Similar than Sonic the Hedgehog, you know. The poor man's bacon in the South, Hoover hog referred to an armadillo. Hoover hog. I love that armadillo. Lines formed at garbage dumps. Waiting for trucks with leftover food from restaurants. Mothers sent their children to ring the doorbells of strangers. Even though that's not true, they hoped whoever answered the door would take pity on starving children and give them something to eat. Many people turned to bread lines and soup kitchens. These places were run by private charities. One of the first soup kitchens in Chicago was run by Al Capone, a gangster. All over the country, the bread line became a familiar sight. Men stood in lines stretching for blocks. They were waiting for a loaf of bread to bring back home, really red. These men were used to supporting their families. Many were terribly ashamed to be seen in public looking for a handout, but they had no choice. Even worse, the bread sometimes ran out of, but they had no choice. Even worse, the bread sometimes ran out before the end of the line. This was one reason soup was so popular. A soup kitchen could always add more water to stretch the soup further. In New York City, as many as 82,000 meals a day were given out free. Now I'll have to stop this, and good night. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye.